Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I'm glad to be here with you. It's July 30th, 2024. It's been a little while since I've been here with you last. A lot has happened in our world, in the United States. We had an attempted assassination on Donald Trump, and subsequent to that, we had a palace coup against Joe Biden, essentially removing him as a candidate from the Democratic platform for president. These are relevant to what I am going to discuss with you at this time, which are essentially the reasons why UAP or UFO disclosure is just not going to happen in 2024, or let us say it is highly, highly unlikely to happen. I realize that's kind of a statement of the obvious. You're out there thinking, yeah, well, tell us something we don't know, Richard. I get it. But I'm going to lay out my reasons as to why. And yes, the political backdrop is one of several significant reasons for that. So again, I just want to thank you for being here with me. I'm very grateful for your support. Before I get any further into this, if you always like what I do, if you're a supporter of this channel, subscribe if you haven't already, send out notifications if you like what you hear, and as always, hit that like button if you like what you see on this video. I've got a couple of slides here, no visuals, just some information that I want to be able to help present, make things a little bit more clear. So I have two parts of this presentation as to why I believe UAP disclosures not going to happen in 2024. So I have reasons for delay of disclosure or of transparency, and then the strategies by which to pursue that, to strategies for delay. As you can see, I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit of detail. So the reasons, I got 5 of each here. National security concerns, I'll get into that. Ongoing investigations, I think that's an interesting possibility. Classified programs, lack of preparedness, and then political instability. You can see I have highlighted. As far as strategies to delay, we have, I will highlight overclassification of UAP data, bureaucratic roadblocks, media influence, selective information release, and a focus on prosaic explanations. There are others as well, but I had to cut it short at some point. I think that's probably a good place to for us to start this conversation. Keep in mind, it was only in 2017. Seems like yesterday, but that's actually 7 years ago, just about, that the New York Times published 2 articles, not 1, but 2, at the same time that Politico also issued an article that kind of opened up the whole global conversation on UFOs. They were not yet being called UAP in 2017. And this was a real shock to pretty much everybody, certainly to myself. You had 2 articles in the New York Times, one talking about the existence of the ATIP program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. This, after years of the Pentagon and of the White House also denying any interest in the subject of UFOs. As recently as the Obama administration, there were official statements coming out of the White House saying, yeah, this is really not anything that we're interested in. No evidence of extraterrestrial life, no evidence that any of them are here. And it's not a thing that we do. We got that back in, I think, 2011, 2012, not that long ago, at the same time that the ATIP program was actually doing its thing. So that was a lie. That was an untruth that the government told us. Just a couple of years later, the New York Times outs that, as it were. Also tells us about the Tic Tac UFO incident, that is the USS Nimitz carrier group event from 2004. We all know about that now. It's an extraordinary event, extraordinary incident. And so when that came out in 2017, I think it was fair for a lot of people to think, did we just hit disclosure? Is the government acknowledge what's happening here? Is really what I think people were wondering. And as things settled out, it became a little bit more clear to those of us who were really looking at it that This is not disclosure. We are looking at a kind of struggle going on behind the scenes. It's what it has always looked like to me, that you've got some individuals, some groups that are trying to push this matter forward, not all for the same reasons necessarily, but nonetheless doing it, and then facing, of course, a very intransigent and longstanding opposition against that. And I do think that is what has been playing out ever since. So we're now into 7 years of this. And the only other thing I'll say as a preface before we get into the meat of this presentation is, over 10 years ago now, I co-authored a book on disclosure with Bryce Zabel, the creator of the TV show Dark Skies. Great to work with Bryce on this project. We called our book After Disclosure. We wrote it back in 2010. It's quite a while ago. It was a different world. And I think we followed a path that it is fair to say probably every other researcher that we spoke to also believed, which was that if there's a breakthrough, you're going to see an avalanche, a complete transformation of our society. You go to bed Thursday night and everything's normal, and then Friday morning, if the news comes out, everything is different. Well, it did not happen like that. I will point out that we called a number of things quite accurately, but not that. No one called that. The idea being disclosure would hit you like a hurricane. You would not know it hit you. The government would be caught off guard, and we'd be in this completely different world, struggling to find our footing. That's not what's happened. We're 7 years now into a major admission by the New York Times and by the political establishment to a large extent, and yet we're really in a place that you still see very skeptical media articles and media coverage on UFOs. Not skeptical in terms of the sightings, but skeptical that they're anything truly anomalous or anything that represents aliens, certainly, but even anything representing something anomalous. We're really not seeing very much coverage like that at all. Nor, 7 years in, are we seeing any coverage dealing with the genuinely important and publicly important implications of secrecy for 80 years at a minimum. I mean, after all, now that we are recognizing this is a real phenomenon, you really have to ask, where has the public established, the media, the political institutions, where have these guys been in asking a very simple question? What's the government been doing for 80 years? And it sure as hell looks like they've been lying to us. Can we please investigate this and look into this? You're not seeing any of that. You're not seeing any media, big media, doing any kind of self-examination over their own failings of coverage for year after year after year, all the ridicule that they were engaged in. You don't see any of that. So we're 7 years in, and we are kind of like on those bicycles that don't go anywhere. You're pedaling, but are you really moving forward? And it doesn't seem necessarily that we are. That doesn't mean there has been no progress in that time. There has been a political movement. We've seen the introduction last summer of the UAP Disclosure Act. Yes, it was gutted fundamentally, but nonetheless, it was significant that it happened. We saw congressional hearings. We had David Grush, and we had a lot of other things that have happened that have been noteworthy. So it's not like nothing has happened. And that's important to recognize also. But I would suspect it's fair to say that most people 7 years ago might have been a little bit surprised that we've moved so little forward since the dam broke, as it were, back in December of 2017. At least I think it's fair to say that many people would feel that way. So let's look at the reasons, the current reasons to delay disclosure or any kind of forward motion of UAP transparency, as we're calling it now. Not even calling it disclosure, if you notice. We've gone from UFO disclosure to UAP transparency. I have talked about this in a prior video on this channel. I do think it's a significant transformation in how we speak about this, but let's just move forward. So first, we'll talk about national security concerns. The first thing to say is that we are in a new and kind of hypersonic Cold War, or a Cold War on steroids. We thought it was intense back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. I think many geopolitical analysts are now seeing that what we are moving into vis-a-vis Russia and China, the United States, that is the Western world, could potentially be even more serious than that. In the old days, it was capitalism versus communism. Well, now we're just looking at straight up geopolitical rivalries, but they are very serious. We see a complete loss of international trust by one side of the other side. It's gone. And I think it will be gone probably for many decades to come. It's just my own opinion, but I'm not alone in that. So you have that reality. Now, it's very different than how things were in the early 1990s when the Cold War did end, the Soviet Union broke apart. China was still very weak compared to how it is today. And U.S. planners, as far as we can tell, were actually wondering, is it time for us to open this up and to have some kind of disclosure? And we don't have confirmation of that to this day, but there's been some pretty interesting, we'll say, leaks and allegations to that effect, which I think are plausible, if not proven. In the early 90s, the United States was sitting on top of the world. No one was really there to challenge the U.S. And it could be suggested or argued back then that in the interest of kind of a world peace, a unifying thing, could be that the United States leads the way toward acknowledging the reality of this other presence here. Well, that didn't happen. And and now we're farther away from that than ever before. So now you're in a position where the United States military, the Russian military, the Chinese military, and other militaries are in various levels of competition with each other. So with that said, let's look at these other bullet points I have here. One concern clearly from the military point of view, and we can never ignore the military point of view in any discussion of disclosure, is will military advantages or any exploitation of UAP technology be compromised in the event of some kind of disclosure about this? This is a thing that doesn't matter to everybody. Not everyone's in the military. Not everyone cares about national security implications of UFOs or UAP. But the fact is, the military does care, and it is important to them, and they have a tremendous amount of say on this because it is quite evident that military players have had dominant or among the dominant influences over the secrecy of this subject. So what they say and what they think matters. And when you're dealing with giving up military secrets, potentially, if you make an acknowledgement that, yes, this is real. Yes, we've acquired some of their tech, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to deny that if you acknowledge that you have been party to, let's say, 80 years of a cover-up, 80 years of lies. It's going to be very difficult to then say, oh, but we don't have any of their technology, when in fact we've been discussing such things openly for the past few years. It seems quite obvious. So there's not going to be an motivation by the U.S. military at all to compromise anything that they may have learned scientifically, technologically from UFOs. But also, there's other things that would be revealed. So there's sensitive information about any of these encounters they've had. In other words, how have we detected these things? How have our electronic capabilities succeeded or failed in detecting these objects? How have our interceptors succeeded and or failed in their attempts to deal with this? These are questions of military capability that one can imagine would not be voluntarily given up by the United States military, or for that matter, the Russians or Chinese are probably not interested in volunteering any of that as well. They certainly don't want the United States to know any more about their capabilities than the U.S. already knows, and vice versa. So there's a lot of sensitive military national security information that everyone wants to keep to themselves. And that remains very, very potent to this day. And also, just even more generally, the exposure of threats and or vulnerabilities in your overall defense system beyond just specifics of electronic detection and the like. It's, where are we weak? Where are we vulnerable? that is not something that the military is going to want to get into. And it's not necessarily the case that they would if you had some kind of generic disclosure, but you're certainly bringing yourself one giant step closer to having that issue raised publicly, where you are going to have to either talk about it or issue a no comment, and they're not probably going to want to do that. One remark that I thought was very intriguing was from David Grush last year when he was giving testimony to Congress, and he talked about the existence of international treaties to the effect relating to this. And how did he say it? He actually said there were agreements, specific treaties between governments to reduce the risk of nuclear war, which includes provisions related to UAPs. I don't know the details of that, but I'm not inclined to disagree with him on this. And the implication is really that revealing sensitive information could disrupt certain international agreements or create tensions with other nations. And just even more generally, if you look at the situation, not from a single national security point of view, but an international point of view, it's very likely that the United States has had a number of covert agreements with other nations that could very well be affected by a UFO or UAP disclosure. I don't know what those details would be, but it would not be outrageous to assume that. And by the way, there are a number of even recent historical examples of the U.S. withholding critical information on UFOs or UAP because of national security. You go back to the 2021 ODNI report. That's the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Came out in 2021. That was the first major UAP report that the government released. There was 144 UAP incidents in there. You might recall, this is now 3 years ago. But you will also remember that report provided very limited information on pretty much anything. And it really emphasized, the need for more data. We need more analysis and all of it. Very cautious approach, which you could really see reflected concerns about revealing sensitive information that could compromise national security. Even something like NASA's independent study from 2022, where at least that's when they announced it, I think. And you could say, well, this was a step towards some kind of transparency, but NASA has consistently emphasized that it has not found any evidence of extraterrestrial life. This has been a completely consistent track of theirs. And certainly it helps to maintain a narrative that UFO or UAP incidents are likely to have conventional explanations, which also is going to be helpful in protecting sensitive information. And even the Tic Tac incident, when that came out, you had folks within the Department of Defense and other officials suggesting that whatever it was that David Fravor and his colleagues encountered, that this could be a drone or some other kind of conventional technology, despite all of the extraordinary maneuvers and capabilities that it showed. So you can see that there has been all throughout this emphasis to kind of create these little prosaic explanations and reduce the pressure for anything more sensational, all for national security. So I think national security obviously is a very important thing. And let us move on to the next. So I have something called ongoing investigations. Now, we've had AARO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. We had Sean Kirkpatrick of AARO talking multiple times how, we need more time to thoroughly investigate these UAP incidents before drawing any definite conclusions. Heard this many times. And of course, the response from the UFO community is to throw rotten eggs at them. And by the way, somewhat deservedly so. I mean, you can see that there's a definite stalling tactic going on there. On the other hand, to say this one thing, to give that office some benefit of the doubt, which I think is fair, is that this subject, this UFO subject, is an enormous learning curve. This is not a simple subject that you can just traipse into and expect to master it within 6 months. It does not work like that. I will never forget my own attitude over 30 years ago now when I first decided to research this subject. And I actually told myself, well, I'll research this for about 3 or 4 months and I'll get to the bottom of it and I'll decide what I think and then I will move on with my life. I mean, famous last words, but it was foolish looking back. But I don't think it's an unusual situation that people find themselves in. They get into this UFO subject and frequently I think they have no idea just how deep it goes. But then once they do, they realize, I'm not going to master this in 6 months or a year or even 2, 3, or 4 years. It takes more time than that. And so when you are looking at a bureaucratic organization like the Old Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, really it's probably unrealistic to expect that they're going to go in as experts. Very unlikely. And so it's actually not surprising to think that you're going to have an office that says, I need more time. Who would want to be in that position? You go in there with limited knowledge of the subject, realistically, and now you're supposed to become an expert. You're supposed to speak authoritatively about this to not just other UFO researchers who are watching you carefully, but to the whole world. So that's going to be difficult. And, you know, I'm speaking as someone who has studied this myself for 30 years. I've been in the weeds on this for a long time. And it's easy to ask, well, why won't this government agency use independent researchers who have done so much research and so much work on this? And it is a fair question, but you got to think of it from the bureaucracy's point of view. This is a U.S. government agency. They are putting themselves out in a public space in a very delicate position, to be honest. Like they've got to make a determination on a subject of great global interest and intrigue that people have all kinds of opinions about. So how do they do it? Well, it's really not difficult to see that a government agency would say, okay, we got to start from scratch. We need our own approach. We're going to have to be as scientific as we can. We got to focus on, exact data collection. We need bulletproof data. That's really what they're going to want, because you're in bureaucracy. You got to follow the age-old rule of CYA. We all know, and you've got to be ultra careful, not allowing yourself the kinds of vulnerabilities that even a private researcher, such as myself or anyone else, can more easily afford than if you're a government agency with all eyes on you. Like they've got to button everything down. So this is a difficult task, frankly, for any bureaucratic agency to be able to deal with this. And we haven't even gotten into all of the other obstacles that they face, but this is one. And I do think it, in fairness, needs to be brought up for them. Another obvious obstacle, or another reason, for delaying disclosure, would be the existence of a whole array of classified programs. And, this is something that we have, many of us in the field have talked about, written about a lot, including myself. But this is, the existence of classified or special access programs related to UFOs and to the technology. This is, I think, a very important factor in the reluctance to disclose information. So think of a statement that David Grush gave last year before Congress. He said that I was informed in the course of my official duties of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program to which I was denied access. That's a direct quote. He said that to Congress last summer. So that obviously suggests the existence of highly classified programs that even individuals with high-level clearances like David Grush are not fully privy to. And it's just worth adding, while I'm on this, talking about David Grush, I never try to miss an opportunity to refer to the research of one of the very great private UFO researchers of all time, that is Leonard Stringfield, who really opened up back in the 1970s and 80s until his death in the 90s, the entire field of UFO crash retrievals and the acquisition of this technology. And I will just point out, Yet again, I've done this many times, but Stringfield's work is foundational. And it's easy. You can buy there's collected articles. It's very long. You can get it on Amazon. It's expensive, but if you're dedicated, it's worth it. I can tell you, I've read it many times. What he did was he collected dozens, probably hundreds of direct cases, either direct witness or spouses of direct witnesses, this type of thing, attesting to military acquisition of UFO craft or technology or occasionally bodies. Stringfield really laid it out. And what we heard last year from David Grush furthers that case. And for many people, that was the first time they'd heard it. But I just want to point out that Stringfield really got into this, as well as other researchers, the late Stanton Friedman, of course, with his work on Roswell, and many other Roswell and other researchers have gone into this. Ryan Wood, a very good friend and colleague of mine, wrote a definitive collection of cases of UFO crash retrievals. My friend and colleague Michael Schratt, similarly, has done outstanding work in this area. It's all out there. But this type of program, clearly, this crash retrieval program that is of supreme classified importance. There can be no question about it. And it's a definite obstacle to further disclosure. It's one thing for the United States government to say, well, we've discovered there is something out there. We're looking into it. It's a totally different thing for them to say, well, yeah, there's something out there. Oh, yeah, and we've recovered their technology and have been studying it for about 80 years. That's a little bit of a different problem altogether, because that now implicates the government in lies, in cover-up, in conspiracy. Absolutely, very, very intense kind of a conspiracy, which is not a position they want to put themselves in at this time. By the way, there's a statement from Grush, and I thought that I had it here. Yes, here we do. I'm going to read it to you. You can see it here. Grush, this is last summer, and he just stated that he said congressional oversight of conventional special access programs discusses the Secretary of Defense's ability to waive congressional reporting. However, he says the Gang of Eight, and Gang of Eight is the top 4 leaders in Congress and the head Republican and Democrat from both the Senate and House Intelligence Committee. So the 8 powerful members of Congress. He said the Gang of Eight is at least supposed to be notified if a waived or unacknowledged special access program is created. In other words, he's saying, look, okay, the Secretary of Defense does have the ability to withhold the information about these from Congress, but at least the top 8 most important members, the Gang of Eight, they're at least supposed to know if there is such a program, and they are supposed to be notified. And they haven't been. So we've got this existence of deeply, deeply classified programs beyond congressional purview, and they're not supposed to be beyond all levels of congressional purview. They are supposed to be under some level of accountability. I have a quote from Representative Anna Paulina Luna. I'll just read it to you. She just said, this is last year too, it is unacceptable that any mid-level unelected bureaucratic staffers can tell members of Congress that we are not allowed to access information about UAPs. That was her statement. And, how do you argue against that? What we're really seeing in that argument, and that statement of hers, is it's references of a war. I've often talked about factional wars going on with disclosure, but there's a different war. It's a war between the old quaint republic that we once had in the United States and the type of state that's grown up, like in the movie Alien, the thing grows up in the belly of the guy, right? That's what's happened. And that thing that's grown out is the national security state, or the national security establishment that's grown up out of the remnants of the old republic that we all once knew and read about. And you see in that statement by Anna Paulina Luna this frustration that the new national security state it's not that new. It's been around for at least since World War II, but is withholding information from the formal representatives of the American people. And she has a problem with that, and she's totally right to have a problem with that. But what we're really seeing is two forms of government really at odds with each other. And so that's a real problem. Lack of preparedness. That seems like a really generic reason for, oh, I want to go back. I don't think I talked about IRADs, did I? Let me go back one moment here. Yeah, let's talk about this. So IRADs are independent research and development. This is something else that David Grush talked about last summer. He talked about misappropriation of funds and the use of IRAD, independent research and development, by contractors to potentially fund classified UAP-related work. In other words, taking the funding and the oversight of UFO, UAP out of the hands of government and putting it into contractors through these kind of cutout operations. And I do think that's a significant obstacle to disclosure. The more and more privatized this phenomenon is, out of, I mean, is it under formal government control or is it not in formal government control? There's really not a lot of clarity on a lot of these issues. You're going to need some really good lawyers, government lawyers, to untangle, I would imagine, the web of like who is responsible. Ultimately, we all know the United States government needs to be responsible and should be responsible. But the fact is, legally, who is actually responsible for these things? Where is the locus of control over this phenomenon? We don't really have a lot of clarity on that. And I think that works to the advantage of secrecy. So then let us discuss lack of preparedness as another motivation for delay of disclosure. I mean, this again seems like an obvious thing, but let's just get into it a little bit. You have from the public and government institutions an obvious, you've got an 80+ year secret here that has gone so far into its own world that we really have no idea how expansive the bureaucracy of secrecy happens to be. I once had a very well-informed gentleman who said to me many years ago that he had learned that the amount of money spent on secrecy of this subject was the amount of money spent on the research and development. No, back up. The amount of money spent on the secrecy, maintaining the secrecy of this, was 7 to 8 times more than the amount of money spent on research and development for science and technology of this phenomenon. Now, I don't know how he knew that, but I respect this man. I do believe he was in a position to know what he was talking about, and that was his assessment. So so when you talk about that level of secrecy, that tells me that the government agencies are totally unprepared for dealing with the implications of a full UFO disclosure or UAP disclosure. There was a statement, remember, from Chris Mellon, I think a year or two ago, and he also, I mean, he was questioning, like, what's going to happen if we announce this openly, that there's an ET present? Are we going to terrify millions and billions of people? His whole take, which you can agree with or not, but was whether the net effect for society would be positive rather than negative. Would it be positive? Because there's certainly potential for societal disruption. And, even when Bryce Zabel and I wrote After Disclosure back in 2010, I mean, it was a lifetime ago, it feels like, we definitely had to acknowledge this possibility. Like, is society going to lose it? Are people going to just go crazy? Are they going to run around in circles, pulling the hair out of their head in full-blown panic? And what else will happen? Our conclusion at that time was that there would be a certain amount of panic and it would be a problem, but we believed, and maybe this will turn out to be true, that the panic would eventually subside because people still have to get on with their lives. Will that be the case? We don't really know. We don't really know. It's a big unknown. I have a quote here from Anna Paulina Luna again. She said, "We've had 3-star generals tell us that we did not have authorized access to this information." In other words, this is a reflection of the classification, of the secrecy, but it is also potentially a reflection of the lack of readiness by even within the government to handle full disclosure of this subject. I mean, we are all of these years into the UFO cover-up, 80 years, where 7 years into an open discussion of some level of this phenomenon in public, and you still have members of Congress like that are not entrusted with this information. So that should be a hint that there are institutions that are not prepared. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to deal with this. Is there potential for widespread societal disruption? Further erosion of trust in our institution, which has already gone to such a degree as it is. So you can see that there's just a lot of fear. When the UAP Disclosure Act was introduced last year, one of the big phrases within it was this idea of controlled disclosure. You could see it even in, when Chuck Schumer introduced this bill a year ago, that there's this fear of an uncontrolled, catastrophic form of disclosure. So there's fear behind the scenes. And I think that is reflective of a sense of a lack of preparedness for this. And, as I say in this final bullet at the bottom, how do you disclose the existence of a lifetime of secrecy? It's very difficult for those individuals responsible for, at least in theory, public safety and also, who may have had some level of responsibility for the UFO secret, which, by the way, we still don't have any clear idea as to what agency that is. Realistically, they're never going to be prepared. Never going to be prepared. Now let's talk about political instability. And this is really the reason that I even thought of doing this presentation. Everything that's happened, even in the last month. Here I am at the end of July, so from the end of June through now has been an absolutely tumultuous month in American politics and reflective of really even global politics. But let's talk about the U.S. situation. So there was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump earlier this month, and then, of course, the palace coup, as many people have called it, I think accurately, of President Joe Biden from running as a candidate for the 2024 presidential election. He was clearly taken out. And by the way, all of the insider discussion has Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer as being responsible for that. I mention this because of Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer, of course, is one of the sponsors of last year's UAP Disclosure Act, probably the most important sponsor of that. He discussed it. This is an issue that he has put himself publicly kind of on the line about. But right now, that was 2023. That was an off-election year. We are now in an election year, and not just any election year. It's a presidential election year that has the name Donald Trump in it and Joe Biden in it. So whatever your thoughts on either side of this, this is a very politically charged election. To the point where you've got each side effectively demonizing the other, a threat to democracy or a threat to freedom, depending on where you fall on that whole argument. And I'm not going to get into those issues here, so don't expect me to at this time, but it's obviously highly, highly polarized and fraught. And what we can see is that a guy like Schumer, his goal right now, the Democratic Party has been in a state of disarray. And they've potentially selected, it looks like, Kamala Harris to be the replacement for Joe Biden to run for the presidency. If that turns out to be the case, we still have to see what happens during the convention. But if that's so, they have a lot of work to deal with here. And you really have to ask, how much time and energy and effort can possibly go in to a UAP disclosure effort for the remainder of this year? I mean, you just look at the political situation. These people are focused on this election. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, you are focused on your team winning the election. And by the way, for members of Congress, which is really where the primary drive for the whole UAP transparency movement has been, even more so than the Senate, it's really Congress. Well, they're up for re-election every other year. So they're up for re-election now. And it's not that they wouldn't deal with the UFO or UAP issue in an election year, but at this particular time, in this particular election, it's very difficult for me, anyway, to see just how you're going to see these members, even someone like Anna Paulina Luna or Tim Burchett, both of whom have been or Jared Moskowitz, they've all been very engaged in this, but can you really see them taking significant time out now to push this matter, either in the form of more congressional hearings, which we have heard discussed even from the beginning of this year, but it hasn't happened yet, has it? Is it likely to happen now as we get into crunch time for the election season? I think it's very, very unlikely to happen. So, there's that. What else do I have here? Let me just pull this back up. That's basically it. I think, we're looking at something that's going to have to probably be put on the back burner as far as Congress is concerned. You can't envision these guys dealing with much of anything else. This is both parties are in, circle the wagons mode here, each for their own side to push this whole matter forward. That's what I think. Now, there's a lot of other elements of political instability when you're even looking at the UFO UAP side of it. Tim Burchett, I think about a year or so ago, said something like, we've run into roadblocks from members from the intelligence community, the Pentagon. He also mentioned an amendment that he tried to include in was the FAA reauthorization bill that was killed by the intelligence community, not just the intelligence committee. What he was really indicating when I read that is a political environment where even modest disclosure efforts are facing significant opposition. And in a politicized environment that what we have now, the totally contentious presidential election that included an attempted assassination. I mean, I just think what we're looking at is an exacerbation of the political instability that we've already been seeing. That remarkably, the UAP subject was able to kind of not have to deal with the kind of polarized Democrat versus Republican politics, but I think it's much more likely to be difficult, at least for the remainder of this year. Now, that may change next as we go into 2025. It may not. We don't know. We'll have to just see. But I do think that for the remainder of this year, it's going to be a very tall order to expect any kind of change along those lines. Let me go into some of the I have the ultimate problem. How do you walk back a secret you've kept for more than 80 years? Exactly. So strategies now to slow walk disclosure or to delay disclosure. It's a bunch of strategies. One I discussed was overclassification, which of course is a very obvious barrier to any kind of disclosure, where even individuals who arguably should be granted access to this information are denied it, where you have competing intelligence organizations that have critical information about this subject may not necessarily be able to share it with each other. You're dealing with the bureaucracy of an entrenched empire at this point, where everyone's got their own domain. And it's not clear that everyone is sharing. So that's one problem. It's like, how do you get to the bottom of this phenomenon when you've got these competing intelligence groups fighting for turf? They cooperate, but they compete. It's that way. Ryan Graves last year everyone likes to talk about David Grush at the hearings last year, but Ryan Graves said something quite significant, which was that since 2021, all UAP videos are classified as secret or above. It's quite a significant statement. He went on to say that this is a real problem in terms of us getting scientific information about all of this and so forth. But all UAP videos, secret or above. Now, it makes me wonder about pre-2021. I have a suspicion that all or most of them before 2021 may very well have been classified as secret or above as well. But he is, based on his information, confirming that at least this is the case now. So that's a kind of interesting statement. Again, with Anna Paulina Luna, I quoted her earlier, this statement, and so I'll just let it go. But I really like what she had to say here. It is, it's unacceptable that any mid-level unelected bureaucratic staffer can tell members of Congress that we're not allowed to access information about UAPs. Yeah, I mean, look, you can't argue against that. One of the things about the UAP Disclosure Act as it has been intended, and I think this is right, like the people behind it, people like Carl Nell, Army Colonel Carl Nell, who is extremely engaged in this matter and very knowledgeable, I must say. And this is his words here. The whole point of that Disclosure Act was to restore oversight and control of the material so it can make better progress scientifically. Well, that's one reason to do it. There's, I think, a lot of reasons to do that. But the point is to allow a UAP review board to be able to not be blocked by classifications of the various departments and so on, so that some group can actually have unrestricted access to this, which I think everyone agrees at some level is necessary. Another strategy for delaying disclosure, for slow walking disclosure, would be bureaucracy. This is not really understood enough, and I include myself here. I am no expert on the inner workings of the Pentagon's bureaucracy. In trying to understand that over the last couple of years, it's a humbling experience, let me just say. It's very, very immense bureaucracy. There's lots of a major labyrinth, you could say. And so, one thing I have come to understand is that the use of administrative processes, interagency disagreements, can be very effective to delay the progress on any kind of UAP initiatives whatsoever. This is the statement by Burchett that I referenced earlier. I'll just restate. He said, our proposed legislation just said, if an airline pilot, this is the FAA stuff, if an airline pilot has a sighting, that when he makes that report to the FAA, that it would come to Congress. But I was told that the intelligence community did not like that. And the bill was not even heard in committee. So again, you've got bureaucratic infighting, bureaucratic roadblocks, turf wars essentially happening that affect Congress as much as any other U.S. government federal agency. So, and then, you could really think of another problem, which is that if you have multiple U.S. government agencies or offices that are dealing with this, whether it's the AARO office or NASA's independent study team, or who knows what else may occur, could arguably be a form of bureaucratic roadblock. We're not seeing that as far as I can see just yet, but I do think that is a potential down the road. So bureaucracy, yes. Media influence, clearly. If you do not know what Operation Mockingbird was historically, you need to know. It is important not just for every American citizen. This wasn't a U.S. program after all, but really for anyone in the world, because this is a model for really what we see around the world now. That is media control and via influence by various national security, intelligence agencies, and the like. That was Mockingbird. It was actively known. We know about this from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. It was exposed in 1977 by the journalist Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. He wrote an article on this and talked about how there were hundreds of U.S. journalists, hundreds, who had been on the secret pay of the CIA during the Cold War, manipulating news and spinning it on behalf of the CIA. That's a known program. But to think that it's ended or gone away, well, clearly it hasn't. You just look around, just read any kind of Western media news, and you can see the fingerprints of the intelligence agencies all over it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But then just looking at the media objectively, look at media coverage of this phenomenon since 2007. And what you really see is that far from some kind of media disclosure effort, the media has been almost completely silent on this. There have been a few punctuated moments where the media has discussed certain things. They did discuss the UAP hearings last summer. There was minimal discussion of David Grush's revelations when you really get down to it. I mean, it happened and then just went away. A couple of media organizations did follow up, which really on something as significant as the potential of UFOs being real and aliens being real and high level, brilliant, intelligent, highly government officials with high security clearances stating this. You would think that this would be a matter of major media coverage, and it hasn't happened. I mean, we've seen it hasn't happened. And what's going on there? I mean, it's really worth asking what has been happening here. Hardly any coverage last summer of the UAP Disclosure Act. And if you have neighbors and friends who don't follow the subject, you know for a fact it wasn't discussed because they're like, what are you talking about? The word really did not get out. This was not media coverage that went beyond or went much beyond the pre-existing UFO community as well. Maybe a little bit beyond, but very, very little. On top of that, if you do any kind of ongoing coverage of how the media handles the UAP UFO subject, you see every week without fail, it's dominated not by pro-UFO articles, but by a very high degree and dosage of skepticism from many of these articles. Not skepticism that there's something going on, that people are seeing something. That is now acknowledged. But skepticism about this phenomenon being anything anomalous or certainly alien. I just saw another article this week. Almost the exact title is, not all, just because it's a UFO doesn't mean it's alien. And you hear this kind of thing a lot. They come up frequently, and I would say to the point where it's still more of a dominant thread than otherwise. And here we are, 7 years into a kind of what we might have thought a post-disclosure world, but we're not there. We're not in a post-disclosure world because we're still seeing tremendous media influence. And it is always important to remind yourself that the media has been in bed with the national security intelligence community for your entire lifetime and beyond. And then another really good tactic, a useful tactic, is selective information release. So there's all kinds of controlled leaks, ambiguous statements, partial document releases. Think about, I've got some examples I've listed down here. So you think of the New York Times article. There was a lot of information that was provided in that article. And, look, you got to give all credit to journalists like Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper, who were involved in those articles. And I do. They deserve some props. So the articles provided significant information, but also left a lot of questions unanswered. And, this is not to blame them because they're not at fault. But what you really are looking at is a selective release of information about ATIP, for example. What were the details about ATIP? Leslie and Ralph and Helene, they didn't have a lot of the information, or they were not able to vet enough of it to publish it. There was a lot of vagaries. And so you had enough information to spark public interest, but not enough to provide any kind of genuine, comprehensive understanding of the program's scope or its findings. Like, we didn't get that. Or think of the coverage of the Tic Tac. So you have the release of the video, which shows a UFO, UAP, encountered by Navy pilots. This is 2004. This is another example. So the video was very compelling, but the accompanying information was extremely limited. The Department of Defense Eventually, it took them 2 years to confirm the authenticity of that video, but they provided almost no additional context or any additional analysis. All of that led to very widespread debate, speculation. You had skeptics for years arguing that the videos were fake, that the audio was a hoax, and all of that because for several years the Navy wouldn't even acknowledge that those videos were legitimate. And then they finally did, but there's no information. It's very selective, partial statement. Or think, I mentioned the 2021 ODNI report earlier. That's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, when they acknowledged the 144 UAP incidents a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. They gave an explanation for just one of those, just one. I mean, kind of amazing. The remaining 143 incidents were categorized as unexplained, and the report stated that, well, we need more data and analysis, but this is a selective release of information. So it just, they highlight the existence of these numerous unexplained phenomena, but they don't give any substantial answers. So it just prolongs the public's quest for understanding. And on and on and on. You could just continue with this type of, partial information, selective information coming out, leaving the public in this state of what's going on here. We don't really have a clue. And that's I think effective in drawing out and exacerbating and extending the whole disclosure or transparency process. And I have felt for years they will drag this out as long as possible. If they can do it for another 5 years, they'll do it. And if they could do it for 50 years or 100 years, they'll do it for 100 years if they're able to extend it that long. I firmly believe this because the problem is way too explosive. It's way too explosive. And then the last strategy to delay disclosure would be a focus on prosaic explanations. We see this frequently, almost on a regular basis. In official statements, you have government agencies, government officials, that very frequently, almost regularly, when this subject comes up, they'll attribute UAP sightings to common phenomena like weather balloons. A Chinese balloon from a year and a half ago, which was openly discussed as a UAP. The Chinese balloon was discussed as a UAP. This, by the way, if we were still in the world of talking about UFOs, I am quite convinced that there is no way in hell that Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick would have the guts to go before the Senate and say that Chinese balloon is a UFO. Like, no one would ever do that. But by changing the language to UAP, he was able to do that. And with a straight face, and the members of the Senate with a totally straight face are like, yes, this balloon is a UAP. So this is a strategy, and it's effective to attribute these sightings to such things like weather balloons or drones or just various atmospheric conditions and the like. They are designed to provide a simple and understandable explanation that can easily be accepted by the public. Straight up, that's all that it is. Other techniques that are used, I write here, selective data presentation. Yeah, presenting data that supports the conventional explanations while omitting and downplaying data that suggests more extraordinary possibilities. That's the norm. And you see this in all of the statements. In Arrow's report earlier this year in 2024, we saw, I think, a great deal of that. Arrow made this statement, made me almost fall off my chair at first, where he's talking about this artifact, and I'm quite convinced that they were referring to the so-called metamaterial with very fine layers of bismuth and magnesium. This has been discussed a lot over the last few years. It's disappeared. It went into the hands of the Army, and no one has found out like what has happened with this. So the Arrow report discussed it, or it seems to have discussed it without actually referring to it specifically, stating that, yes, it was a prosaic manufacture, nothing outrageous, nothing crazy. And you're left wondering, Where did this come from? How, like, could you please show us your work? You know, you learned to do that back in junior high school. Show your work. Show your work here. What are you talking about? But it was a very selective data presentation, and all designed really to shape a narrative in favor of mundane explanations of this phenomenon. And on and on. You know, the whole idea of using expert testimony. They bring in experts who can credibly argue for prosaic explanations. This is a very typical tactic that you find. Experts from, I don't know, meteorology or aviation or astronomy, and whoever you can use, bring them in. That can provide an authoritative voice to reinforce the idea that these objects have conventional explanations. And then don't ever leave out the media influence in coming up with prosaic explanations. I just talked about the media a moment ago, but the media is very, very important, where, you know, the national security apparatus will always seek to leverage its relationships with major media outlets to ensure that the stories that emphasize prosaic explanations receive more coverage, which, you know, won't completely bury all alternative narratives, but it can help to drown them out and kind of put them to sleep, as it were. So I think that's kind of the strategy that we're looking at. I think that there are other strategies that are likely to come into play, but I think these 5 are pretty good ones. And as far as the motivations, again, I think we are not in a place right now that is amenable to a genuine UFO UAP disclosure. I just don't see it happening this year during this election cycle specifically. But even beyond the election, we have to remind ourselves we're dealing with a subject that is deeply, deeply entrenched in secrecy and secrecy protocols, and a United States bureaucracy, an empire bureaucracy, not just any old government, but this is a government that manages a global empire. To expect resiliency or flexibility and a willingness to admit that it's lied is probably asking for a great deal. So I think we're going to be looking at a lot of resistance for a long time. And I'm going to leave you with this one thought. In our community, particularly when the subject of disclosure is raised, it's very easy for us to fall into this idea of like an election horse race. Like, it's the same thing when you have an election. You know, rather than focusing on issues, we tend to think, who's ahead? Who's got the battleground states, and who's going to win this, and who's going to win that, and who's going to lose, rather than even dealing with issues. I mean, often this happens, and I think it happens with disclosure. So there's this tendency to focus on, can we make it happen? What are the obstacles? And yes, that's important to understand. But let us not forget that this is a phenomenon that people around the world experience every single day, every day. And these events are extraordinary. I have been talking for some time about a very large book project that I'm working on that deals with USOs, that is unidentified submersible or submersed objects. It's taken a lot. It's going great. Still needs a little more time. But what I am constantly amazed by, not just simply the extraordinary nature of many of these encounters, but how many of them, not all by any means, but many of them are exceptionally well documented, investigated, attested to. There is no doubt, in other words, about many of these cases. Others certainly look like they really occurred, but the evidence may not be always as strong. You know, you just may have someone's testimony from a number of years later about what happened on a Navy vessel. Interesting. We want to know those cases. But then there are other cases that are exceptionally well documented and just utterly extraordinary. In other words, that's a phenomenon that is absolutely happening, and I will be very much looking forward to releasing that data when I publish it all. But the point is, we are dealing with a phenomenon that involves an intelligence that does not appear to be from our civilization. That's the bottom line. And that operates with exceptional sophistication, that also seems to be engaged in planning, that seems to be sophisticated when it comes to us as well. In other words, this phenomenon shows all signs of being able to know a lot of things about us and of being very interested in what we are doing in a whole variety of ways. So we're dealing with a high-level sophisticated group of someone that is here for reasons that appear to be very important to them. And we want to know what's happening in this phenomenon. We clearly want to know, because this is clearly something of great importance. And we've got a long way to go. We have a long way to go to get really good, powerful, meaningful answers as to what those intentions are, what the scale of activity happens to be. I think it's very wide. I think the scale is very, very broad and very wide and very deep. Is this something we have to worry about or not? Do we have a clue? Maybe yes, maybe no. This is debated, but we need to get on top of this, because we're not just dealing with this phenomenon from our perspective. We're dealing with it from someone else's perspective that's not us, a great unknown or unknowns. We need to get on top of this. And as we move further and further into the 21st century, moving into a complete transformation of our very society in all these different important ways, we are going through a major transformation now. I think it's time that we get on top of this issue and make it public and deal with it in as adult and responsible way that we can. And at this point, I do think that that means genuine, honest, real disclosure. Clearly, there are going to be elements that military people are going to say, we cannot share this. Well, maybe we can have that conversation. But an acknowledgement of the reality, we're past due on this. We do need to know. This is an existential matter. Existential in the most truest sense of the word. It's like relating to our very existence. This is a very important matter indeed. All right, well, anyway, that's what I've got for you. I hope you found this interesting, engaging. If you, as I said when I started, if you like this video, then like it. Hit the like button. Hit notifications so that you don't miss when I do come up with new videos. And share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. And if you're really interested in what I have to do, by all means, do visit me at my website, richardolanmembers.com. I do this kind of work all the time, and I'm very active there as well. So with that, I will leave you. I will be back again soon. Everyone have a great day, and let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.